Good evening. I want to remind everyone that 7 years ago, Nechama invited me the first time to Stanford. And when she called the second time, a couple of months ago, I think I responded within an hour, saying that I would be most happy to come back because I found the experience here to be very lively. An educated, interested, and committed audience, interested in American policy in the Middle East, and committed to the same ideas and ideals that have motivated me in my professional career. So it's good to be back in Stanford. I join all of you in congratulating Nechama on this anniversary of the center, and I'm happy to join you for what will not be as happy a discussion as we've had until now, because we will be talking about the Middle East. When I started to think about tonight's topic, what kept going through my head was the movie Groundhog Day. Some of you may remember it. It's a movie about a TV reporter who is assigned to cover a Groundhog Day out in western Pennsylvania, and through time warp ends up living the same day over and over again until there's obviously a change in his own perspective on life, and he's able to proceed forward. And in some respects, talking about the Middle East does bring up questions of Groundhog Day, because even though in these past 7 years since I was in Stanford, and we talked that evening primarily about the Middle East peace process, but I recall also suggesting that there were problems endemic to the Middle East that seemed impervious to change. And in reviewing those notes, I could use them again tonight. Because even though so much has changed in this region over the past 7 years, the reality is that it is still a region that faces extraordinary problems. And many of those problems may have changed externally, but the underlying dynamics still remain to be addressed and resolved. So I want to look at that tonight for a few minutes under the title of terrorism and state collapse and borders that are no longer borders, to see whether or not we can derive any lessons for our next president. And as she or he faces these challenges, what will be on the agenda for the next administration, again, no matter who wins this election. Now, as I do in my classes at Princeton, I start with the global. The next president is going to walk into the Oval Office and face an array of problems almost unprecedented for an incoming president. When you start to list them on the global scale, and I'm not even going to talk about domestic politics, you can see what kinds of challenges this will present to our commander-in-chief, our president. The implications of Brexit on the transatlantic alliance, the rise of China, and the stability of relations with our allies and adversaries in Asia, changes in our hemisphere as a result of the beginning of normalization with Cuba, but it's only a beginning, and it's not yet solidified to a point where we can pocket that progress and assume it's going to continue. The resurgence of a very independently minded and somewhat aggressive Russia, as we've seen not only in places like Crimea and Syria, but almost reminiscent of the years of Soviet-American rivalry in the Cold War, a Russian policy that seeks to exploit openings wherever they exist in order to expand Russian power and influence. Transnational issues, climate change, pandemics, health matters that we have seen can create such chaos and distress globally, and that take up our attention, as we saw, for example, with the Ebola crisis in Africa. Refugees, migration, international terrorism, the list goes on and on and on. And that's before you even talk about the Middle East. When the president then turns from the global and narrows the lens aperture to look at the Middle East, that president will face even more intense challenges. What to do about ISIS and the challenge of global terrorism that has proven so resilient to any kind of opposition that we've been able to muster to it, and much of it coming from radical Islamist sources in an Islamic environment in which there frankly has not been enough talk about reform. I had a professor in graduate school, Charles Isawi, one of the great economists of the Middle East, who said only half-jokingly that the way he analyzed Islam is it was a religion that had not yet undergone a Protestant Reformation. The point being that Islam needs to cope with its own internal challenges. And while it has not yet fully begun to do that, many have taken a path that has led them into violence and extremism. Implementation of the Iranian nuclear accord. One of the great breakthroughs of recent diplomacy, but it's a breakthrough that requires such vigilance that the question for the next president is going to be, can she or he motivate a bureaucracy that didn't negotiate that agreement to treat it as their own? We know from past experiences, and I've written about it in two of the books that I've authored, presidential transitions often lead to significant policy changes simply as a result of the failure of a new president to take ownership of what a previous president had done. We analyzed, for example, the transition from President George H.W. Bush to President Clinton back in 1993. There had been a great procedural breakthrough in the Bush administration in the form of the Madrid Peace Conference. The Clinton administration didn't own the Madrid process. And for almost 5 years, what we call the peace process floundered, went off in directions that did not advance the prospects for peace, and left behind a legacy of significant ill will between the very parties that had signed onto not just Madrid, but in 1993 actually signed onto the Oslo Agreement, which broke the taboo of relations between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization. And so we will have a president, perhaps one that will continue the same party affiliation if Secretary Clinton wins, but can Secretary Clinton motivate the new administration, or could Mr. Trump motivate the new administration to take as seriously the need to implement a very challenging and very detailed Iran agreement? Questions of what to do about Syria. The Middle East is not the most pressing humanitarian region in the world, but Syria has witnessed the death of nearly 500,000 people over the past 5 years, the creation of a refugee problem of enormous proportion is putting strains mostly on its immediate neighbors in Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey, but has now also created a migration and refugee flow into Europe itself that is changing the demography and the politics of the region in ways which will take years to unravel and to restore where we were. The proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. You all recall that on the eve of the Iranian agreement, there were indications that if that agreement had not been signed, that other countries in the region would have entered upon a pathway of securing their own weapons of mass destruction. There was an assumption that Saudi Arabia was already working with Pakistan to acquire nuclear know-how. Egypt had a nuclear program many years ago, gave it up, but was starting to talk about resuming nuclear technology and resuming access to nuclear technology and re-educating itself about nuclear know-how. In other words, the possibility of a weapons of mass destruction arms race in this already volatile region. And of course, the ongoing Arab-Israeli conflict, which many believe no longer is on the agenda because regional leaders have largely ignored it over the past couple of years as they're trying to cope with their own problems. But when you go from the leadership level down to what's called the Arab street, the Arab-Israeli conflict still resonates, and it still requires leaders in the Arab world to pay attention. And to the extent that they don't pay attention will be the extent to which they may face internal challenges in the future. So why do you want to run for president when you're going to face this kind of a challenge? That's a different question. I'll come back in a couple of years, Nechama, we'll talk about that. The reality is, though, that one of these two people is going to face this formidable array of issues, and will have to make some very difficult choices, none of which is easy, and none of which is without its own risks and its own set of ensuing problems. What are some of the underlying problems that reminded me so much of Groundhog Day? Middle East, again, in the past 7 years, we've seen Arab revolutions, we've seen the dissolution of states, the erosion of borders. But if you look below the external factors, the same problems exist that we talked about 10 years ago. The resistance of this region to the positive side of globalization. Now, globalization is not a panacea, and it has its own problems, its own drawbacks. But the Middle East today produces almost nothing of value to the rest of the world except what it pumps out of the ground in terms of oil and gas. You remember 15 years ago, Tom Friedman's The Lexus and the Olive Tree. The point Friedman was making was not that you had to become a globalized society in order to prosper, but it was if you didn't find a niche within the global economy and global society, you would become, and it's only his words, and I'll quote him, you would become roadkill on the way to global success. And there's nothing that the Middle East produces that the rest of the world is waiting for. There are no parts of the Lexus in that Lexus and the olive tree that the Middle East produces and exports to car manufacturers. One of the second problems that relates to the failure of globalization is the fact that the Middle East doesn't really trade with the rest of the world. We did an analysis when I was in government 20 years ago, and we determined, looking at trade statistics, that the Middle East's trade with the rest of the world constituted only 7% of its total trade. And all of its trade was with its neighbors, even though the manufacturing and agricultural production within these societies was not complementary. It was competitive, producing the same thing and yet not having found a way to export it, to produce the capital that would be invested in order to create jobs locally. And it's exacerbated by the fact that even today, so much significant part of the sovereign wealth that's produced as a result of oil and gas exports is not invested in the Middle East. It's invested in the West or in Japan or in the big banks in Switzerland. In other words, the Middle Eastern rulers are not even using that which they are producing, which is the fossil fuels that drive so much of our economy and the rest of the world's economy, to help advance their own societies. All of this has created a situation of tremendous weakness within these societies. And I don't mean weakness in terms of human capital, because the people in the Middle East are as smart and as wise and as entrepreneurial and as brave as anyone else in the world. But the situation has produced deficits which the Middle Eastern specialists themselves know about and have identified. 14 years ago, 2002, the United Nations Development Program asked 70 Arab intellectuals and public policy people to look at themselves in the mirror. The UNDP said, we could hire Western pundits, experts, to do this study, but they're Westerners. Look at yourself. Figure out what it is that your societies suffer from, and then maybe in terms of development programming, we can find ways working together to fill those gaps. Well, 14 years ago, the first of what became 5 Arab Human Development Reports was published by these Arab intellectuals. And they identified 3 deficits within their own society. In other words, again, this is not Westerners trying to define what's wrong with the Middle East. These were folks looking in the mirror. Number 1 was a deficit of knowledge. What they meant by that was that universities and high schools and grade schools in the Middle East were not producing thinking graduates. Sure, there was a lot of stuff going on in class, but it was rote memorization. You had to know a certain amount of facts in history, and you had to know how to do certain kinds of equations in math. But there was nothing within their educational system, these experts said, that produced the creative genius that the societies required, a deficit of what they called knowledge. Second was a deficit of freedom. They recognized themselves that the absence of free speech, freedom of association, free press, free political discourse was inhibiting the growth of these societies. There's a long debate in academia about whether economic openness can produce political openness, or whether political openness can produce economic openness. And what most experts ultimately agree is that you kind of need both. You may advance a little faster in the political sphere, or you may advance a little faster in the economic sphere, but you can't do one in the absence of the other. And the great China experiment, which some Middle Easterners believe that they can replicate, the idea of maintaining a tight grip on freedoms within society while advancing the economies of their societies, doesn't work outside of China. And frankly, we're not even sure in the long term it's going to work inside China. Different subject for a different evening. So a second deficit defined by these experts was a deficit of freedoms, basic freedoms. And the third deficit that they themselves defined was a deficit of women's empowerment. And it was a simple proposition that they laid out. How can we, Arab policymakers, public persona, intellectuals, seek to advance our societies when 50% of our population can't do what the other 50% do, whether it's the extreme of not being able to drive or no access to key professions, or the kind of mistreatment of women that's still prevalent in some societies in that region. So we're now 14 years later from 2002. There have been 4 subsequent Arab Human Development Reports, and if you read them, you weep, because there's no progress made on any of these issues. Endemic problems seemingly impervious to change. What that creates is not just deficits, but you can see how it saps the strength of these societies themselves. And these are societies that are largely governed not by folks who have been elected through free and fair democratic elections, but folks who don't enjoy legitimacy. In fact, one of the great ironic aspects of the so-called Arab Spring is that the only sector of the Middle East that's been immune from these internal challenges have been the monarchies. There are 8 Arab monarchies, 6 in the Gulf, Jordan, and Morocco. Bahrain faced a problem for a short period of time, largely Shia Sunni, had less to do with internal legitimacy issues. But the legitimacy of the monarchies, in a sense, kept a lid on the potential for uprising within these societies. Every other Arab society doesn't enjoy that legitimacy. And that lack of legitimacy created the grist for what became the Arab revolutions of 2011 and afterwards. All of these societies face succession struggles. You know, if you want to see one of the antecedents of the breakdown in Syria, you go back to the year 2000, when Hafiz al-Assad, the father, passed away. The Syrian constitution at the time said that you had to be 35 years old to become president of the country. And Hafiz al-Assad had never thought about changing that constitution because he had always assumed that his eldest son, Basil, was going to succeed him. Well, a couple of years before that, Basil was killed in an auto accident. And Hafiz didn't change the constitution. But upon his death, the Syrian parliament met and within an hour amended the constitution so that the other Assad, Bashar, could take over. Succession? It wasn't succession. It was a way of, in a sense, creating an endowment for a kleptocratic family that maintained criminal control over not just Syria, but also over Lebanon. These issues have also created what we now are experiencing as the failure of states and the breakdown of borders. Think about the Middle East 30 years ago, when the centers of power which exercised influence, even if they weren't powerful, were Baghdad, Cairo, and Damascus. Nobody pays attention to what comes out of Baghdad, Cairo, and Damascus these days, because state power in the Middle East has diminished to a point where it's essentially a joke. Not only that, but think about 30 years ago, when you had a dominating figure such as Gamal Abdel Nasser, the leader of the Egyptian revolution after 1952, who tried to create a brand of pan-Arab, relatively secular supranationalism. And what you have now is not Nasserism, but Nasrallahism, where Islamism has replaced the idea of secular pan-Arab nationalism with the idea of Islam as a motivating force within the societies. And so you don't have state power. You don't have an ideology that is motivating people to move their societies forward, and it's had its impact. Think about the following. In the Arab-Israeli context, since 1973, we've had any number of wars between Israel and Arabs. Not one of them has been primarily between Israel and an Arab state. Arab states have been drawn into some of these wars. 82, for example, the war between Israel and the PLO drew Syria in after it had started. But state power in the Middle East is so weak that there is no state confrontation any longer with Israel. They're non-state actors. States are no longer the primary players on the Middle East chessboard. And so you have this region which is in tremendous crisis. We tend to think of it today only in terms of the proximate issues that our president, our diplomats, our military have to face. But even if we resolve the proximate issues, even if Secretary Kerry and Foreign Minister Lavrov actually succeed in achieving a ceasefire in Syria, which is what they're trying to do. And I give them tremendous credit for trying to do so. Even if they achieve that, have they addressed any of the underlying issues that brought Syria to where it is today? And the answer is no. In fact, one of the things I do in addition to teaching at Princeton is I chair the American side of a non-governmental dialogue with Russians, counterparts, former ambassadors and and some current academics, to talk about Syria. And we have spent our entire focus over the past 2.5 years working through what a political transition in Syria would look like. Interestingly, it was not we who brought the following to the table, but it was the Russians. As we were trying to work out the mechanics of who would take over and how would it happen and what the transition period would be and how do you have a separation of powers and so forth and so on, the Russians came into our, not the last meeting, the meeting before that, and said, you know, you essentially have a mukhabarat state. It's a state in Syria that is controlled at the top by the Assad clique and its allies. But what really pervades that society is the Secret Service, the internal police. And so even if you work out a transition which, you know, takes the head and pushes it aside, and you put something else in place, maybe a transition regime towards elections and so forth, how are you going to get down into the society itself, which is so pervaded now by the mukhabarat, by the secret police? And any of you who has visited anywhere in the Middle East and has not understood this phenomenon, it means you've been a great tourist, but you haven't had your eyes open, because the Middle East is pervaded by a mukhabarat mentality. We used to notice in Cairo, my wife Sheila and I lived there for almost 7 years in 2 different assignments. On every street corner there was somebody watching. Not an official, as it were, not a member of the formal state bureaucracy, but just keeping an eye out. And then once a day, the mukhabarat would come by and collect little pieces of information. And these folks would know whatever we were doing. They could probably tell at the end of the day exactly where I had been and what I had done, even though I wasn't being followed per se. But this pervasive idea of being watched really imbues many of these societies. So what does the next president do about this? Now, in one respect, it would be really terrific if, as in academia, you could kind of go into a conference room and call together a bunch of experts and task out papers and come to a conference and then come up with conclusions. Next president's not going to have a lot of time to do that, which means that she or he will have to confront immediately 4 issues that are so pressing even before you get to the underlying problems that beset the Middle East. And I want to spend a few minutes on each of those to maybe help us think through what that next president is going to confront in office. I would list the first as Iran. And as I noted earlier, the challenge now is not, as Mr. Trump has said, to undo the Iranian agreement. The challenge now is to see whether that agreement works. In other words, the fight over whether or not there should have been an agreement with Iran on nuclear weapons development should be seen by all of us as over, at least during this decade, 15 years of the life of the agreement. And we should, if we could, come to a consensus of zero tolerance with respect to possible Iranian infractions. Now, that's going to be hard to do because there is almost nothing in our society today on which we reach consensus, let alone on an issue as critical as the Iranian nuclear program. But if we don't, we may find ourselves in a situation of incremental cheating on the part of Iran, where it's hard to find the line in the sand beyond which you won't let Iran go. In other words, if they're allowed X amount of enriched uranium on their soil, and they have X plus 0.1%, is that the line in the sand? Now, I can tell you that in the Obama administration, yes, that has been the line in the sand. And every single infraction, even possible infractions that Iran has approached in implementing its obligations under the agreement, has been treated by the current administration as cosmic. And so far, the Iranians have backed down on every one of those occasions. There was a question of interpretation about the level of enriched uranium. The United States and its negotiating partners insisted on our interpretation. The Iranians backed down. The Iranians had not, in the first blush of implementing the agreement, exported all of its enriched uranium that was supposed to. They backed down under pressure. Each one of these issues down the line. And so we need that kind of adherence to a zero-tolerance policy for the next 10 years. Now, for any of you in the professions and in business, you know how hard it is to maintain 100% vigilance in your own business 100% of the time. We all blink periodically, and we take vacations, and we have sick days, and we have turnover of personnel, and we have periods in which we're training new people and all the rest. But we can't afford for that to happen in the implementation of this agreement. Now, as we get into the Q&A a little bit later, I want to be clear that I am fully supportive of the diplomacy and the agreement that brought this about. And I lobbied in Washington for it, particularly with Democratic senators. Republicans had made clear that they were not going to vote for it. Our objective was to try to bring as many Democrats on board so as to prevent that magical number of 60 turning the agreement down. I'm fully supportive of it. But that almost doesn't matter now, because that's the policy that we have to implement. And the next president, Clinton or Trump, needs to make sure that there is zero distance between the agreement itself and what the Iranians do. Now, that carries over to relations with Iran that are not in the agreement, because the agreement very much focused on Iran's nuclear pretensions and capabilities. It did not focus on Iranian behaviors in the region. And maybe it was for good reason. It happened to have been a point with which I disagreed with the administration. I thought that we should have found a way to include in the negotiations some measure of control or rollback of Iran's aggressive behavior in the region, but the administration made a determination that that could have brought the agreement down. But that doesn't give Iran a free pass, which means that even as we expect implementation of the agreement on the Iranian part, and in which we also implement it, when you see in the newspaper today that Congress, in a lame duck session after this election, may decide to impose new sanctions, you ought to get on the phone with your congressman and say, hell no, that's a violation of our side of the agreement. So even as we're hoping that both sides adhere to this agreement, we also have to make sure that Iran doesn't believe that it's gotten a free pass to support the Houthi rebellion in Yemen, to continue funding and arming Hezbollah, to believe that it can create, in what it has defined in its own terms as an Iranian sphere of influence, or what the king of Jordan once called a Shiite crescent, extending from Iran through Iraq, through Syria, through Lebanon, to the Mediterranean coast. That it would be inimical to American interests, inimical to the interests of our allies, and the fact that we're trying to make Iran adhere to a nuclear agreement doesn't mean that we give Iran a free pass to do its aggressive behaviors in the region. Second challenge the president will face is ISIS. Now, the reality is, even though there hasn't been a lot of talk about it, that ISIS is on the run quite a bit. There's an article just the other day, I think it was yesterday, in fact, which suggested that ISIS scholars are trying to find Quranic interpretations that justify their withdrawal from places like Mosul and Kobani. In other words, if you are the caliphate and you've based your religious domination on your interpretation of the Quran, well, how can you justify withdrawing? And so they're busy now trying to find ways of saying these are tactical withdrawals in order to conserve our strength and come back another day. But it also tells you that they are a bit on the run, and that the policies that have been laid out by first General John Allen and now Ambassador Brent McGurk in creating something like 10 separate international coalitions. There's a military coalition, there's a public diplomacy coalition, there's a financial flows coalition, there's a recruitment coalition. It's very complex, but it also is one of those phenomena that has to be maintained over a long period of time without our flagging. And if we are consistent and resilient in our backbone and determination to push ISIS back, we can succeed. Now, I have always wondered about the words defeating ISIS. I don't know how you defeat this amorphous movement, because even if we do constrict and constrain the reach of ISIS in Syria and Iraq ungoverned space, little ISISes will form elsewhere. They're in Sinai right now. They're in Libya. They're in Nigeria. So I don't think you will ever, or we will ever in our collective lifetime, reach a point where we have a parade down Fifth Avenue with ticker tape saying we've defeated ISIS. But we can maintain the kind of determination to keep pushing back against this ISIS and the next ISIS and the one after, and to minimize the threat that it poses. It will take a lot of hard work. Third, Syria. We were talking about this a bit at dinner, and the suggestion that I made at dinner was essentially the Hobbesian choice that our next president will face. On the one hand, there is almost no justification that one can really seriously come up with that would turn Syria into an American national security interest. They weren't our friends for the last 50 years. They don't produce anything that's of significance to us. They don't occupy the kind of geopolitical space that we need for our purposes. From a hard, cold, calculating, what's called in political science, realist interpretation of our national interests, Syria is not a prize. And if the Russians feel so connected to Syria that for them it is a prize, it's not a big deal to me if they quote unquote win. On the other hand, you have a humanitarian crisis of enormous consequence. And the question that the president is going to face is how you weigh a conflict zone where any solution is going to be almost impossible to obtain in the near future, which should not, under almost any definition, bring American forces to play against the need to protect people who are sitting ducks. They are being bombed by barrel bombs. They're being destroyed. There is a confessional cleansing going on. You look at the villages on the outskirts of Damascus today, and there is a concerted effort to push the Sunni population out of them so that minorities, Shia and Alawite, will take over. You have this enormous pressure on Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey. Jordan, which is still reeling from the pressure of the Iraqi refugees created by our 2003 invasion, now has another wave of Syrian refugees. And they haven't even finished dealing with the Iraqi refugees. And now you have, as I mentioned earlier, the pipeline to Europe and the implications that has for European stability. And what does the president do in that case? Now, one of the candidates says that he has a plan to defeat ISIS and presumably to defeat Assad. Haven't seen it yet, so it's hard to comment on it. The other candidate says that she wants a no-fly zone. Well, we did a study at Princeton 4 years ago, in 2011-12. This was before the chemical weapons had been removed from Syria. And our study concluded that a no-fly zone at that time would require 50,000 American troops on the ground. Because if you believe that the Assad regime would agree to the no-fly zone, well, you don't need American troops at all. But why would you believe that he would simply turn over and say, sure, I will allow the Americans to declare a part of my country as a forbidden zone for my own Air Force, which at that time meant that he would probably at least threaten to bring the chemical weapons out of the depots and at least threaten to use them, which meant that your first task, in addition to possibly suppressing air defense systems, was to take control of the chemical weapons depots. Well, 90% of the chemical weapons are now out. You still have the task of suppressing air defense systems, and that task has become exponentially harder. Because since last September, the last 13 months, the air defense system of Syria has become the air defense system of Russia. And you can see in the Washington Post or the Guardian maps of the coverage of the Russian air defense system. If you want to see an interesting analysis of what that means, read the Israeli press. There's an article a couple days ago in the Israeli press where one of their military correspondents said that without doing anything particularly noticeable, the Russians have constrained Israeli air power. Because, as it was written in the article, every plane that now takes off from airfields in northern Israel shows up immediately on Russian radar screens. Now, that doesn't mean the Russians are going to shoot those planes down, but if American planes or NATO planes are being sent in to enforce a no-fly zone, will the Russians not shoot those planes down? And so if you want to deal with a no-fly zone, you have to think about the air defense system that can be employed by those who don't want you to have a no-fly zone. So it's not so simple to have a slogan of a no-fly zone or a safe zone unless you start to think through the implications. And if you think through the implications and convince yourself that it's not doable, you're still left with the humanitarian crisis. The Arab-Israeli situation, and with this I'll conclude and we'll get to the very happy discussion that will follow. Some of you know, if you were here 7 years ago, that I am a lifer when it comes to the peace process. I have believed throughout my career, I've studied the peace process, I've worked on it, I've written about it, I've analyzed it. It is not only possible to reach a two-state solution, and is not only possible, it is still the single most imperative outcome for the safety and well-being not only of the Palestinian people, but also of our friends in the State of Israel. And I challenge anyone, and I'd be willing to come back, Nechama, if you want to have a little discussion here, to make the argument that Israel is better off without a Palestinian state as its neighbor, with all of the difficulties and all of the security challenges that a Palestinian state will pose to the State of Israel. I was on a panel, late President Peres used to convene an annual conference in Jerusalem, which talked to the main issues of the day. And I was invited once to a panel with 4 Israelis. I was the only non-Israeli. On my left, although actually my right ideologically, was Dr. Dori Gold, who just resigned as the Director General of Israel's Foreign Ministry. He's been a longtime supporter of Prime Minister Netanyahu, was their ambassador, Israel's ambassador to the UN when Netanyahu was Prime Minister in the 90s. And on my right, not ideologically, was the late Mayor Dagan, a 40-year veteran of the Israeli army, 8 years as the head of Mossad, including during the period when I served as ambassador, and I got to know him quite well. And Dori Gold made the argument at this conference that given the situation in the region, again, this was a couple of years ago, so it's after the so-called Arab Spring, not even as bad as it is today, but it was bad. Given the situation in the region, given the breakdown in the peace process over the years, and given the value to Israel of the strategic depth that holding on to the West Bank provides, Dori Gold said that the requirement of defensible borders meant that Israel could not yield anything in the West Bank. It could yield some political autonomy, some political freedoms, but it could not allow a Palestinian state with a degree of independence and sovereignty to emerge that in itself would become a challenge to Israel's defensible borders. This was the argument that Gold made, and it was a summary of a longer study that the think tank that he had previously headed, the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, had published. They had published a long study, you can go online, it's still available, called The Need for Defensible Borders, something like that, and they have a series of analyses on why Israel needs to maintain the territorial depth that the West Bank provides. I mean, many of you, maybe all of you, remember the map of Israel before 1967, the narrow waistline opposite Netanya, the threat posed to Israel's population centers, its manufacturing centers. Dagan spoke next. And he said, you know, with all due respect to Dr. Gold, said the job of the IDF is to defend Israel's borders. And he said, I don't know if there's any abstract definition of a defensible border. A defensible border is the border that the IDF defends. So if you ask the IDF, would you rather be on the hilltop as opposed to the valley, they'll say yes. Would you rather be a little bit further to the east rather than a little bit further to the west, they'll say yes. But at the end of the day, if the IDF's participation in negotiations results in the government's decision to put a border down, the IDF will defend that border. Number 2, he said, to think that defending a border is only a matter of tangibles, like territorial depth or amount of weaponry, or even the distance that a rocket can fire, misses a major point. He said one of the major variables in setting up a defense doctrine is understanding who your enemy is and who your neighbor is. And if you work out an agreement with a neighbor, and you can have some confidence that that neighbor will try to defend its own border, which is also your border, that becomes a major function of Israel's own security. Because it's not just Israel defending the border from the threat on the other side, it's the other side defending the border for its own purposes. And he cited the case of Jordan. Israel's best defense on the Jordan River is not the couple of hundred Israeli soldiers who are living in the Jordan Valley or stationed in the Jordan Valley. It's the Jordanian army that is maintaining the integrity of that border against terrorist infiltration, against the possibility of any kind of attacks against Israel for Jordanian purposes. They're not acting as an agent for Israel. But Jordan understands its responsibilities, which if they don't exercise those responsibilities, Israel has a right under international law to hold Jordan responsible. Go back to Entebbe in 1976. Israel was justified under international law to do what it did in Entebbe, not because it's strong or because they felt the need to rescue their hostages. It was because the government of Uganda abandoned its responsibility for the safety of people on its territory. And when that happens, a state has the right to take action to protect its own citizens. Jordan understands that. So it's not doing Israel a favor by closing that border. It's doing itself a favor. It doesn't want Israeli intervention to do what the Jordanians should be doing. And Dagan said, that's what we're trying to do with the Palestinians. It is not a secret, and it is also not for nothing, that most of the main advocates for a two-state solution in Israel today come from the security establishment. How many of you saw The Gatekeepers? Not enough. Nechama, you have to show The Gatekeepers.
Okay.
Gatekeepers was a film, a documentary, in which 6 former directors of the Israeli Internal Security Service, the Shin Bet, after they had retired, went on record saying that they carried out the policies they were supposed to carry out, which included killing and jailing and doing all the things they needed to do to protect Israel. But they all insisted that the only real security for Israel was peace with the Palestinians, all of them. Avi Dichter a little bit less than the rest, the other 5 much more than Dichter. You have 200 generals in the commanders for Israel's security who are demanding that Israel make peace with the Palestinians. You've got 500 generals, colonels, police officials in the Council for Peace and Security. You can Google all of these, they're all online, demanding that Israel make peace with the Palestinians. These are the people who have been defending the state of Israel as part of their life's mission, and they understand the imperative of peace not because it's nice and rosy and, we all sing Kumbaya around the campfire. They understand it because it's vital for Israel's security. And so the challenge for our next president is going to be whether she or he understands that it's also vital for our national interests. Now, you remember President Obama in 2009 came into office, appointed George Mitchell, started out on a track in which people thought there was going to be serious work on the peace process. Didn't work out too well. Didn't work out too well because some of the tactics that the United States used were wrong. They were just wrong. Didn't work out too well because the Israeli government really didn't want to freeze settlements and took a relatively hardline position. Didn't work out too well because the Palestinians refused to make concessions on critical issues. So this is not easy. This is not a question of a president snapping her or his fingers and bringing everybody back to the table in a manner conducive to peacemaking. But I would suggest to you, as one who has spent a lifetime working on this, that we have devoted so little time to this peace process that it is almost criminal. If you count the number of hours in which the United States and the Israelis and the Palestinians have actually sat in negotiations. Now, we tend to think of it, it's 25 years. You're talking weeks of actual negotiations. We spent so little time that it is almost imperative for the next president to try to figure out how do you bring these parties back together again on the basis of a serious set of terms of reference. And that's the critical issue that I would suggest we all watch for. Because if our next president or Secretary of State gets up and says, I call for negotiations to resume, full stop, ain't going to work. The next president will have to articulate terms of reference which narrow the parameters for the two sides to enter into negotiation and will be based on what the two sides have actually talked about over the years. In 2008 with Olmert and Abbas, in 2013 with John Kerry's diplomacy, we know a great deal about where the two sides may be willing to go. And we used to think they were this far apart, and they're now this far apart. And so the next president has to articulate terms of reference that solidify this difference, and so they don't wander off into well-known differences of opinion. So if you just take these 4 issues, you can see how the next president may walk into the office, look at the desk, and decide to call it quits. It's a very rough set of issues. But they are so critical to our country, and they are manageable with the right kind of determination and backbone, that maybe we can have some optimism, have a better policy in the years ahead. Thank you very much.